The 17th of January, 1942, Bataan Peninsula, Philippines. The jungle breathed. Thick, humid air clung to the skin like wet canvas, and beneath the canopy of mahogany and bamboo, where sunlight barely penetrated, the world was a cathedral of rot and green. American soldiers crouched in foxholes carved from red clay, their uniforms stained dark with sweat and mud, their faces gaunt beneath steel helmets. They had been there for weeks, holding a line that grew thinner each day, and in their hands they clutched rifles that felt heavier with every passing hour. But it was not the enemy that haunted them most in those first terrible weeks of 1942. It was hunger. In their packs, they carried cans of corned beef hash, cans of beans, cans so heavy they clanked against canteens and ammunition pouches. The rations were designed for another war, for static trenches in France where supply lines remained open and field kitchens could follow the advance. But this was the jungle. This was the edge of an empire collapsing in real time, where supply ships burned in Manila Bay and the roads were choked with refugees fleeing the Japanese advance. The cans were too heavy, too bulky, and in the oppressive heat, the food inside spoiled before it could be eaten. Men opened tins to find beans turned to slime, meat buzzing with flies. And so they went hungry, even as they fought. Across the Pacific, in the stone corridors of the War Department in Washington, generals and logisticians were beginning to understand a brutal truth. America was unprepared. Not unprepared in spirit or industrial capacity, those would prove boundless, but unprepared in the smallest, most intimate details of war. The nation that could build a bomber in an hour had no food designed for the jungle. The arsenal of democracy had no ration for the rifle-carrying infantrymen who had to march, fight, and survive in the wet hell of the tropics. And in that absence, men were dying not from bullets alone, but from malnutrition, dysentery, and the slow erosion of the body that comes when soldiers cannot eat. This was the crisis that would give birth to the K-Ration, a compact meal in a waxed cardboard box that would become one of the most iconic symbols of American logistics in the Second World War. But the story of its creation is not a tale of foresight or preparation. It is a story of desperation, innovation, and the peculiar genius of a nation that learned to feed its soldiers only after watching them starve. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the Army's field ration system was a relic of the First World War. The standard issue was the reserve ration, later redesignated the C-ration. Cans of meat and beans, cans of bread, cans of vegetables, all packed in wooden crates that weighed over 40 pounds. It was food designed for a war of trenches and railways, where logistics moved on predictable schedules and soldiers could heat their meals over open fires. In the jungles of the Pacific, in the deserts of North Africa, in the mountains of Italy, these rations were worse than inadequate. They were a liability. The cans rusted in saltwater spray. They burst in the heat. They were too heavy for paratroopers, too bulky for reconnaissance units, too slow to prepare under fire. Soldiers complained that opening a C-ration required a can opener, a utensil easily lost in the chaos of combat, and that heating the contents required time and fuel that frontline troops did not have. Worse, the rations were monotonous. Day after day, the same beans, the same hash, the same stale biscuits. Men ate because they had to, not because the food sustained morale. And morale, as every commander knew, was as vital as ammunition. The crisis came to a head in the first months of 1942. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces were retreating into the Bataan Peninsula, a narrow strip of jungle and mountain where they would make their last stand before the fall of Corregidor. Supply lines were severed. The garrison was eating half rations, then quarter rations, then whatever they could scavenge from the jungle monkeys, snakes, leaves boiled into bitter soup. In North Africa, American units training for the invasion of French Morocco realized their rations would not survive the desert heat. In the Pacific theater, planners preparing for the island-hopping campaign understood that they needed a ration that could be dropped by parachute, carried in a soldier's pocket, and eaten without preparation. They needed something light, durable, nutritious, and fast. But no such ration existed. The man who solved the problem was not a general or a government nutritionist. He was a professor, Dr. Ansel Keys, a physiologist at the University of Minnesota, had spent the 1,930 seconds studying human metabolism and nutrition in extreme environments. He had climbed mountains to measure oxygen consumption at high altitude. He had placed volunteers in refrigerated chambers to observe the effects of cold on the body. He understood, better than most, what the human organism required to function under stress. And in early 1942, when the War Department came calling, he turned his attention to the most basic question of military logistics. What is the minimum a soldier needs to survive? Keys approached the problem with scientific rigor. A combat soldier, he calculated, burned between 3,000 and 4,000 calories per day, depending on the intensity of activity. The ration had to provide at least 3,000 calories to prevent weight loss and fatigue. It had to be compact enough to fit in a standard-issue musette bag or a cargo pocket. It had to be durable enough to withstand tropical heat, Arctic cold, and rough handling. It had to require no cooking, no can opener, no water. And it had to taste good enough that soldiers would actually eat it, even under fire. The specifications were daunting. The entire day's ration could weigh no more than 2 pounds. It had to be waterproof, shockproof, and tamper-proof. It had to provide not just calories, but a balance of protein, fat, and carbohydrates, along with essential vitamins and minerals, and it had to be cheap enough to produce by the millions. Keys began his experiments in the spring of 1942, working in a laboratory at the University of Minnesota with a small team of researchers and representatives from the Quartermaster Corps. He tested dozens of combinations: dehydrated meats, compressed biscuits, dried fruits, chocolate bars, powdered coffee. He subjected samples to extreme temperatures, dropped them from heights, submerged them in water. He fed prototype rations to soldiers on training marches and asked for feedback. And slowly, through trial and error, he arrived at a formula. The result was the K-Ration, named, according to popular legend, after Keys himself, though the official designation stood simply for ration, type K. It consisted of 3 small boxes, one for each meal: breakfast, dinner, and supper. Each box was made of waxed cardboard, waterproof and airtight, and together they weighed just 2 pounds. Inside, the contents were simple but carefully chosen. The breakfast unit contained a can of veal loaf or ham and eggs, along with crackers, a fruit bar, instant coffee, sugar, and chewing gum. The dinner unit held a can of cheese or processed meat, more crackers, a packet of lemonade powder, sugar, and cigarettes. The supper unit included a can of beef or pork loaf, crackers, a chocolate bar, bouillon powder, and more cigarettes. Each meal provided roughly 1,000 calories, and together they met the minimum nutritional requirements for a day in the field. But the genius of the K-Ration was not just in its contents, it was in its design. The boxes were small enough to slip into a pocket or a parachute bag. They could be eaten cold, without utensils, on the move. The waxed cardboard was lightweight but strong, and it burned well, so soldiers could use the empty boxes as fire starters. The inclusion of cigarettes, coffee, and chewing gum was deliberate. These were not just creature comforts, but psychological necessities that boosted morale and helped soldiers cope with stress. The K-Ration was not meant to be eaten for weeks on end. Its calorie count was too low for sustained use, but as a short-term field ration for mobile operations, it was revolutionary. The first K-Rations were issued in the summer of 1942, and they went to the paratroopers. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, training for the invasion of North Africa, needed rations that could survive a jump and be consumed on the move. The K-Ration was ideal. It was light, compact, and soldiers could carry 3 days' worth in their webbing without significant weight penalty. When the paratroopers dropped into Morocco and Algeria in November 1942, as part of Operation Torch, they carried K-Rations, and the rations performed as designed. Men ate on the march, in foxholes, in the back of trucks bouncing across desert roads. The food was bland, the portions small, but it kept them moving, and that was enough. Word spread quickly. Reconnaissance units requested K-Rations. Rangers requested them. Tankers, whose cramped vehicles had no room for bulky C-ration crates, requested them. By 1943, the K-Ration was in mass production, with contracts awarded to companies like the Wrigley Company, Heinz, and Cracker Jack. Factories across the United States churned out millions of boxes, packed them into crates, and shipped them to Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, Italy, and every theater where American forces operated. By the end of the war, over 100 million K-Rations had been produced, making it one of the most widely distributed food items in military history. But the soldiers who ate them had mixed feelings. On one hand, the K-Ration was a marvel of convenience. It could be eaten anywhere, anytime, with no preparation. It was far lighter than the C-Ration, and for troops on the move, paratroopers, scouts, armored crews, it was indispensable. On the other hand, it was monotonous. The portions were small, and men who ate K-Rations for more than a few days in a row lost weight and energy. The cheese spread, known universally as cheese cement, was nearly inedible. The crackers were so hard they could chip teeth. The meatloaves, whether veal, ham, or pork, all tasted vaguely the same, a uniform blandness that inspired a dark humor among the troops. They called the K-Ration cardboard cuisine and sawdust on toast. They joked that the rations were designed not to feed soldiers, but to starve the enemy into surrendering their own food. Yet they ate. They ate in the rain-soaked hedgerows of Normandy, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, in the coral atolls of the Pacific, where the sea spray rusted every metal surface and the humidity turned paper to pulp. They ate because the alternative was hunger, and hunger sapped strength faster than fear. And in eating, they participated in a logistical miracle that their enemies could scarcely comprehend. The Japanese soldier, by contrast, carried rations that spoke of a different philosophy entirely. His standard field ration, when it was available at all, consisted of rice, barley, and pickled vegetables, supplemented by canned fish or meat when supply lines permitted. But supply lines rarely permitted. The Japanese military, stretched across the vast expanse of the Pacific, relied on local foraging and the expectation that soldiers would live off the land. The doctrine was called self-sufficiency, and in practice it meant starvation. On Guadalcanal, in New Guinea, in the Philippines, Japanese soldiers ate roots, insects, and the bark of trees. They boiled grass into soup and chewed on leather belts. Disease and malnutrition killed more Japanese troops than American bullets, and prisoners of war, when they were taken, were often emaciated, their ribs visible beneath skin stretched tight. When these soldiers encountered American supplies, whether captured in battle or scavenged from abandoned positions, they were stunned. Here were not just rations, but abundance. Cans of peaches in syrup, bars of chocolate, packets of instant coffee. Food that was sweet, rich, calorically dense. Food that came in boxes marked with cheerful English phrases, U.S., Army Field Ration, and packed with care. Food that seemed, to men who had been starving, like a message from another world. One Japanese officer, captured on Saipan in 1944, later wrote in his diary about finding an American supply dump. "We discovered crates upon crates of rations," he recorded. "Chocolate, canned fruit, biscuits. We ate until we were sick." It was impossible to understand. How could they afford to give such food to their soldiers? We had been told the Americans were weak, decadent, that they could not fight. But men who are fed like this do not know weakness. The contrast was ideological as much as material. The Japanese soldier was taught that suffering was virtue, that endurance through deprivation proved his spiritual strength. The American soldier, by contrast, was fed as a matter of policy. The United States military, influenced by decades of nutritional science and a culture that valorized abundance, believed that a well-fed soldier fought better, marched farther, and recovered faster from wounds. Logistics was not an afterthought, it was a weapon, and the K-ration, for all its flaws, embodied that philosophy. The German soldier, too, encountered American rations, and the experience was equally disorienting. The Wehrmacht had its own field rations, and in the early years of the war they were adequate. Canned meats, black bread, butter, cheese, even chocolate and cigarettes. But by 1943, as Allied bombing devastated German industry and the Eastern Front consumed resources at a catastrophic rate, the quality and quantity of German rations collapsed. Soldiers on the Western Front subsisted on thin soups, ersatz coffee made from acorns, and bread bulked out with sawdust. When they overran American positions or captured supply trucks, they found K-rations, and the contents astonished them. One Wehrmacht corporal, interviewed after his capture in France in 1944, described opening a K-ration breakfast unit. "There was a small can of eggs and ham," he said. Real ham, not the potato paste we were given. There were crackers, solid and fresh. There was coffee, real coffee, and sugar, and even chewing gum. I could not believe it. We had been told the Americans were running out of supplies, that their factories were failing. But here was proof that they had more than we could ever imagine. This was the power of the K-ration, beyond its nutritional content. It was psychological warfare, waged not through propaganda, but through abundance. Every K-ration was a small waxed cardboard box filled with the evidence of American industrial might. It said, "We can afford to give our soldiers chocolate. We can afford to include cigarettes, coffee, sugar, gum. We can afford to wrap each meal in waterproof packaging and ship it across oceans to the furthest corners of the earth. You cannot." The K-ration became a symbol, and symbols carry weight beyond their physical form. In the hands of a soldier pinned down by mortar fire in the Italian mountains, a K-ration was a lifeline, a promise that he had not been forgotten, that somewhere behind him, a vast machine was working to keep him alive. In the hands of a freed prisoner of war, liberated from a German stalag or a Japanese camp, a K-ration was a miracle, a taste of safety and civilization after months or years of brutality. In the hands of a starving civilian in a liberated French village, a K-ration was a gift, proof that the Americans had come not just to fight, but to feed. There are photographs from the liberation of concentration camps in 1945 that show American soldiers distributing K-rations to survivors. The images are almost unbearable to view. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms, their eyes hollow, their hands trembling as they reach for the small cardboard boxes. The soldiers, young men themselves, often look away, unable to meet the gaze of people who have endured what they cannot fathom. The K-rations, in those moments, were inadequate. They could not undo what had been done, could not restore what had been taken. But they were something. They were food, and food was life. And in the act of giving, the soldiers performed a small, human kindness in the midst of inhumanity. The rations also fed allies. French resistance fighters, supplied by airdrops, carried K-rations as they sabotaged rail lines and ambushed German convoys. British commandos, operating behind enemy lines, supplemented their own rations with captured American supplies. Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front received American food aid, including K-rations, as part of the Lend-Lease program. And though they grumbled about the taste, Russian palates found the cheese spread particularly offensive. They ate, and kept fighting. The K-ration, in this way, became a thread that stitched together the Allied cause, a tangible link between the factories of the American heartland and the front lines where democracy was defended. Yet the K-ration was never perfect, and the army knew it. Complaints poured in from every theatre. Soldiers reported that the crackers turned to mush in tropical humidity. The fruit bars, made with dried apricots or prunes, were so dense they were nicknamed laxative logs. The meat loaves, though nutritious, had a greyish, unappetizing appearance. The portions, adequate for a day or two, were insufficient for sustained combat operations. Men who ate K-rations for weeks at a time lost weight, developed vitamin deficiencies, and suffered from low morale. Medics reported cases of constipation and diarrhea in equal measure, both attributed to the rations. In response, the Quartermaster Corps continually revised the K-ration. New menu items were introduced: pork and beans, chicken loaf, beef stew. The crackers were reformulated to resist humidity. Vitamin-fortified candies replaced some of the sugar tablets. Toilet paper was added to each box, a practical necessity that soldiers appreciated more than any amount of chocolate. By 1944, the K-ration had undergone dozens of modifications, each small but significant, each aimed at improving the experience of the soldier in the field. But the fundamental problem remained. No ration, no matter how well designed, could replace a hot meal. Soldiers craved the taste and comfort of food cooked by human hands, served on plates, eaten at tables. The K-ration was survival, not sustenance. It kept men alive, but it did not nourish the soul. And so, whenever possible, units rotated men off the front lines to field kitchens, where cooks prepared hot meals using bulk rations and fresh ingredients, scavenged or requisitioned locally. These meals, stews, roasts, bread baked in field ovens were events, small celebrations that restored morale and reminded men that they were human, not just cogs in the machinery of war. The cooks themselves were heroes, though they rarely received recognition. They worked in tents and ruined buildings, often within range of enemy artillery, hauling water, chopping vegetables, tending fires in all weather. They knew that a hot meal could do more for a unit's fighting spirit than a pep talk from a general. And they knew that the K-ration, for all its convenience, was a poor substitute for the real thing. As the war progressed, the K-ration evolved from a specialized item for paratroopers and scouts into a standard field ration issued to frontline infantry, tankers, and support troops. By 1945, American soldiers in Europe were receiving K-rations as their primary source of food during offensive operations. The ration had become ubiquitous, a fixture of military life, and its small waxed boxes littered every battlefield from the Rhine to the Elbe. But its very ubiquity bred contempt. Soldiers who had eaten K-rations for months developed a deep, visceral hatred for them. They invented elaborate rituals to make the rations more palatable, crushing crackers into soups, mixing cheese spread with cocoa powder to create a kind of improvised dessert, trading cigarettes with French civilians for fresh bread or eggs. Some units held contests to see who could prepare the most creative meal using only K-ration components. The winner of one such contest, held by a company of the 1st Infantry Division in Germany, produced a stew made from chicken loaf, bouillon powder, crushed crackers, and wild onions foraged from a field. It was, by all accounts, terrible, but the ingenuity required to create it boosted morale. There were moments of humour, too. Soldiers discovered that the waxed cardboard boxes, when folded in a specific way, could be used as makeshift stoves, with the wax acting as fuel. They joked that the K-ration was the only ration that cooked itself, and that the boxes were more useful than the food inside. They composed mock poems and songs about the rations, dark comedies that expressed frustration and camaraderie in equal measure. One such song, popular among infantrymen in the European theatre, went, "Oh, the K-ration is a soldier's friend, from dawn until the day's dark end, with cheese that sticks and crackers dry, and meat that makes you wonder why. But eat we will, and eat we must, or turn to bone and turn to dust. So here's to Keyes and his cardboard box, the food that feeds, the food that mocks." The song was silly, profane, and deeply affectionate. It captured the ambivalence soldiers felt toward the K-ration. Gratitude that they had food at all, frustration that it was never enough, and a grudging respect for the system that delivered it to them, no matter where they fought. On the 8th of May, 1945, the war in Europe ended. Across the continent, American soldiers celebrated, firing rifles into the air, drinking liberated wine, embracing strangers in the streets of shattered cities. But the celebration was brief, because the war in the Pacific continued, and men who had fought through France and Germany were told they would soon be shipping east to join the invasion of Japan. That invasion never came. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August brought the war to a sudden, terrible conclusion. Japan surrendered, and the world exhaled. For the soldiers, the end of the war meant something simple and profound. They could go home. They could leave behind the mud and blood and hunger, the endless days of fear and exhaustion. They could return to a world where meals were served on plates, where food was abundant and varied, where no one had to eat from a waxed cardboard box ever again. But the K-ration did not disappear. Millions of boxes remained in warehouses, on ships, in supply depots scattered across the globe. Some were destroyed, dumped into the ocean, or burned in vast pyres. Some were given to displaced persons camps, where refugees, many of them survivors of concentration camps, ate American rations as they awaited resettlement. Some were sold as military surplus, finding their way into the hands of Boy Scout troops, camping enthusiasts, and survivalists who valued their compact design and long shelf life. And some were kept. Veterans brought K-Rations home as souvenirs, small mementos of a time that had shaped their lives. They stored them in attics and basements, and over the years, as memory softened the hard edges of experience, the rations became objects of nostalgia. Men who had once cursed the taste of cheese spread and stale crackers now looked at the boxes with fondness, remembering not the food, but the friends with whom they had shared it, the places they had been, the world they had saved. The legacy of the K-ration extends far beyond the Second World War. Its design influenced every field ration that followed. The C-ration, improved and streamlined in the post-war years, borrowed heavily from the K-ration's compact packaging and no-cook convenience. The meal, ready to eat, or MRE, introduced in the 1980 seconds, and still in use today, is a direct descendant, with its waterproof pouch, flameless heater, and calorie-dense contents. The principles that Ancel Keys established, lightness, durability, nutritional balance, psychological support, remain the foundation of military food science. But the K-ration also represents something larger. It is a testament to the American approach to war, an approach that prioritized the welfare of the individual soldier and understood that logistics, not just firepower, won battles. The United States military fed its troops better than any other army in history, and that difference mattered. It mattered in the jungle, where well-fed soldiers could march farther and fight harder. It mattered in the desert, where hydration and calories meant the difference between survival and collapse. It mattered in the mountains, the forests, the cities, every place where men fought and bled. Food was not a luxury, it was a weapon, and the K-ration was one of its sharpest edges. The ration also symbolized the broader economic and industrial power of the United States. At a time when most of the world was starving, when rationing and scarcity defined civilian life even in wealthy nations, America produced food in such abundance that it could feed not only its own soldiers, but its allies, and even its enemies after their surrender. The K-ration, packed in a cardboard box in a factory in Ohio or Illinois, shipped across oceans, dropped by parachute into jungles and deserts, was proof of a system that worked, a democracy that delivered, an economy that could outproduce and outlast any totalitarian rival. For the soldiers of the Axis powers, this was perhaps the most demoralizing discovery. They had been told that the democracies were weak, divided, incapable of sustaining a long war. They had been promised that the Americans, in particular, were soft, spoiled by prosperity, unwilling to endure hardship. But the evidence said otherwise. The Americans endured. They fought, and they won, and they did so while eating chocolate bars and drinking instant coffee. The K-ration was a small thing, a mundane thing, but it carried a message. We are stronger than you know. We can afford to care for our soldiers. We can afford to win. In the end, the story of the K-Ration is not just about food. It is about the choices a nation makes, the values it upholds, the care it extends to the men and women it sends into harm's way. It is about the understanding that a soldier is not a tool to be used and discarded, but a human being whose welfare matters, whose survival depends not just on weapons and training, but on the essential act of being fed. The K-Ration was born of crisis, forged in the desperate days of early 1942, when defeat seemed possible, and the Philippines were falling and the jungle was swallowing men whole. It was born of necessity, designed by a scientist who understood that the body has limits, that hunger weakens the will as surely as fear, that food is fundamental. And it was born of a vision, a belief that even in the darkest hour, even in the midst of a war that would claim 60 million lives, it was possible to care, to provide, to nourish. That vision was imperfect. The K-Ration was never beloved, never celebrated. It was endured, tolerated, sometimes despised. But it worked. It kept soldiers moving, kept them fighting, kept them alive, and in doing so, it became part of the fabric of victory, one thread among millions, but a thread nonetheless. Today, the K-Ration is a relic. Museums display examples behind glass, the waxed cardboard yellowed with age, the contents long since inedible. Collectors trade them online, paying surprising sums for intact boxes from 1,943 or 1,944. Historians write about them, analyzing their design, their distribution, their impact on military logistics. But the soldiers who ate them, the men who opened those small boxes in foxholes and on beaches and in the wreckage of bombed-out cities, they are fewer now, their numbers dwindling with each passing year. When they speak of the war, they do not often speak of the K-Rations. They speak of the friends they lost, the battles they fought, the fear and exhaustion, and brief moments of grace. But sometimes, prompted by a question or a memory, they will mention the rations. They will describe the taste of the crackers, the texture of the cheese spread, the sweetness of the fruit bar that provided a small comfort on a bad day. And in their voices, there is something more than nostalgia. There is gratitude. Gratitude that in the midst of chaos, someone had thought to feed them. Gratitude that they had not been forgotten. Gratitude that they had survived. The K-Ration, then, is a reminder that wars are fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with bread and water, with the small acts of care that sustain the body and the spirit. That victory is built on countless unglamorous details, the logistics and planning and foresight that keep armies moving and men alive. That even in the machinery of war, there is room for humanity, for the recognition that every soldier, no matter how far from home, deserves to eat. And perhaps most of all, it is a reminder that abundance is not a weakness, but a strength. That a nation capable of feeding its soldiers, of caring for them in the smallest ways, is a nation capable of enduring. The K-Ration was a small thing, a waxed cardboard box filled with crackers and canned meat, but it was enough. It was enough to make a difference, to tip the balance, to help win a war. In January 1942, American soldiers starved in the jungles of Bataan, their packs heavy with useless cans, their bodies weakening from hunger. By the summer of that year, they carried K-Rations, light and durable, and ready to eat. The transformation was swift, born of necessity and ingenuity, and it changed the way America fought. It changed the way soldiers lived, and in the end, it changed the world. That is the legacy of the K-Ration. Not a perfect solution, but a good one. Not a luxury, but a necessity. Not a weapon of war, but a tool of survival. And in the hands of the soldiers who carried it, in the jungles and deserts and cities where they fought, it was enough.